Well, what's going on, guys? I'm in my studio back in Portugal, which lets you know that things will work out in the end. Bit of a spoiler. Anyways, I'm back in my studio and I'm talking about my Canon R6 today. In Namibia, and that trip's like 3 months old now, so I'm way behind, sorry about that. But in Namibia, we basically got to Etosha and I decided I wanted to focus on the photographs. And I wanted to just shoot video and shoot photos and figure out a video later. So I didn't film anything about talking to the camera or anything like that. I just filmed everything on my Canon R6 with a 500mm lens, and I shot photos and I had an awesome time. And I think the photos came out pretty awesomely. In this video, I'm going to share about 38 different photos. So in a 4-day span, I've got 38 photos with the Canon R6 that I love. So I'm going to talk about the Canon R6, and this is a bit of a review video. I've got notes, because as you guys know, I'm not much of a specs guy. I'm a practical person, and I will say this thing about the Canon R6. And this is the most important thing you'll take away from this review. There was not a single time where the camera stopped me from getting the photo that I wanted to take. That's the only thing that really matters. So let's jump back to Namibia and dive into this review. Okay, the first thing on my scribbles is the stabilization. I'm going to talk about video and photo, and honestly, this isn't in order. I just scribbled this down now. The image stabilization on the R6 was the main reason I switched to it. And the image stabilization on the R6 is one of the reasons that I'm having a really hard time using both it and my R. Because on my R, I feel like everything is shaky now. All the clips that you're gonna see this whole episode are shot at 500mm, and the in-body stabilization's on. The in-body stabilization is phenomenal. It's unbelievable. It's so good that sometimes it feels like things are shot on a gimbal. But the one downside I will say about the in-body stabilization is that it does drain the battery a lot more than without it on. I would say with any in-body stabilization, my battery drains twice as fast. But luckily the batteries are still pretty good, and even shooting like 500, 600 photos a day like I was in Namibia, I wasn't burning a whole battery in a day. I would still just use one battery. The next thing I need to talk about is the second reason that I switched to the R6, and that's 120 frames per second. 120 frames per second makes everything even more buttery smooth. It makes that in-body stabilization pop even more because now you have a second level of stabilization. Anytime you slow something down, it stabilizes it. So I shot mostly 120 frames per second. There is a downside to 120 frames per second in that when you shoot 120, you get no audio. Meaning that if you forget to switch it off of 120 and you start talking to the camera, your video clip is just going to be slow motion of your face with no sound. I don't know that that was slow mo. You know what I mean though, you get no sound. With 120 frames per second, I have to think a little bit more. That being said, it does look really buttery smooth. I also think 120 frames per second can be a little bit of a crutch in filmmaking. A lot of times, because it looks better, you can just shoot 120 frames per second for everything, but 120 frames per second slows down things, it changes the mood. And in filmmaking, you need to adjust the frame rate to the mood of the situation. The next thing I want to talk about is the dynamic range, because this was extremely noticeable in this camera. Like to the point that when I was editing some of the photos, I would reduce the highlights and the sky would look gray. Like bland, nasty gray. It was almost like there was too much dynamic range. There was too much I could do and I could play with. The dynamic range is so good that it's past the point of necessity, even to the point of it almost becomes HDR, like more than your eye can see. And to me, as soon as a dynamic range reaches that point, you've gone far enough. So dear Canon, thank you for finally going far enough, because this was one of the things that constantly Sony users would give me a hard time about, because the dynamic range on the Sonys was far superior to the Canon. There's no doubt about it. It was way, way, way better up until this. And I would say that the Sony a7 III is still better, but not better in a way that's a necessity. Numbers, and these are scores ranked by, I can't remember who, DX Mark maybe? The Canon R6, which this video is about, has a landscape score of EV 14.3. In comparison, the Canon R, which I fully admit has terrible dynamic range, is a 13.5. The Sony a7 III has a 14.7. The Nikon Z6 has a 14.3, which is the same as the R6. And then the Sony a9 II has a 14. So in my opinion, once you hit about that 14 mark, I think you're good. Yes, the dynamic range was phenomenal. I really shot in some really tough conditions. In Namibia and in Etosha, the light is super harsh. And I really didn't have any issues bringing the light to a place that I liked it. I was shooting into some crazy backlight, I was shooting into some really contrasty scenes, and there wasn't a situation where I was like, this isn't solvable with a dynamic range. And yes, good light is still good light, but having a nice dynamic range definitely helps. Next thing is sharpness. I thought this camera was incredibly sharp. And sure, sharpness comes from the lens a lot of times, and the 500mm 4 that I was using was version 1. It's a fairly old lens, and I didn't have any sharpness issues. So the compatibility between that lens and the R6, yeah, there was no issues. Almost everything I shot was sharp. And a lot of that help is the autofocus, obviously, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Low light's another thing Sony used to crush Canon on, and probably still does. But I did find that the low light photos and the low light autofocus from the R6 was really, really good. The R6 has a native ISO of going all the way to 102,400, which is high. And I shot these night clips at that at 60 frames per second. And ignore the weird lines in it. That's not from the camera. It's because these water holes at night are lit up. And it's just the way the light looks from the giant lights. You have the option to push things to double, 204,800 ISO. And that was unusable. When I pushed it to that level, it was, yeah, you couldn't use that footage for anything. So imagine your native ISO, that's what you use. Coming back to things like sharpness, I found the shutter speed to be phenomenal. Another reason I had a hard time going back to the R is the shutter speed was just a little bit faster on the R6. And we had these lions, and these lions were being lazy for 2 days, and then on day 3 they decided to be incredibly rowdy. And maybe look away in case you're sensitive to things like this, but the lions found a baby jackal and decided that they were going to play like rugby with the Jackal. And so there was a lot of movement, there was a lot of action, and I was firing away. I think I probably took 400 frames in a span of a couple minutes, and I don't feel like I ever missed a moment. The R6 has an electronic shutter speed of 12 frames per second and an electronic of 20 frames per second. That means that when you're shooting electronic at 20 frames per second, you're nearly at 24 frames per second, which is like acceptable cinematic video. That's crazy. So you shouldn't be missing moments. As a result, I think that on this trip to Namibia, I managed to capture that perfect moment better than in years past when I was using the 5D Mark IV or even the Canon 6D, because there was always that gap between a really good photo, and then that perfect moment could sometimes fall between it. I didn't miss that moment anymore. After we kind of had our like tough morning with the lions, I wouldn't call it a tough morning, it was incredible and that's nature, but we were like a little bit, wow, that was tough to watch. We went off and we were exploring some harsh light elements again, and I want to talk about something that I realized that day that I actually didn't even know the R6 had because I didn't ever look at the manual or the specs, and that's cropped video. What the R6 has is it has an option for you to crop your video down. It just basically squeezes down the video. You still get 1080p, but it looks farther. It looks zoomed. Of course, it's not zoomed, it's just cropped, but it looks that way. And with things like wildlife, that can be very, very helpful for video. It allows you to almost feel like you have more lens than you actually have. So I was able to get clips of animals that were really far away that were maybe more detailed or impactful than they would have been farther back. So that's a feature I really love, but again, something that you have to remember that you've switched on. Because there was a couple times where I switched it on, forgot to turn it off, and then I was talking to the camera and it's literally just a shot of my face. So you have to be conscious of these things when you're filmmaking, and I sometimes forget. Oh, something I forgot to talk about is the buffer. And maybe this goes back to the shutter speed of the camera. I never once had an issue with the buffer. The whole trip to Namibia, never once did my camera ever say, please wait saving photo, or please wait buffering. Never, not once. Not through any of the scenes I shot, not through anything that happened on the trip. Never once did that happen. And yes, I use good memory cards. This is the SanDisk Extreme 128 gigabyte card. It's 150 megabytes per second. But 150 megabytes per second when you're shooting 20 frames per second, that burns through pretty quick. And again, I never had a single issue. There was never a moment that happened. A thing that was awesome and not awesome, the autofocus. The autofocus on the Canon R6 is incredible. It's got over 1,000 focus points, which is insane. When they grade it, it says approximately 100% of the frame has autofocus points. Which, to give you an idea, I used to use the Canon 6D, and it had 9 autofocus points, and only one of them was a cross type. So basically I went from 1 to over 1,000. Now, a thing that Canon tried to adjust or has implemented in these cameras is the animal eye-fi. And obviously with wildlife photography, that's something I was really excited for. But it was also something I was really disappointed in. Animal eye-fi worked amazingly on cats. It worked really, really well on leopards and lions and hyenas. Basically, dog and cat-like animals, it worked really well. It did not work very well on things like rhinos or elephants. In fact, sometimes it would pick an autofocus on something like their ear, like rhino ears. It thought rhino ears were eyes a lot. So Canon's got a lot of work to do when it comes to the animal eye-fi. It got to a point that I just didn't expect it was going to work ever. And when it did come up, I was really surprised. That being said, the autofocus in itself is incredible. They say it autofocuses down to minus 6.5 EV, which is incredible. And in low light situations, it was focusing perfectly. I never ever had an issue. And I had issues focusing through branches and brush as you usually do. And there was a couple times I switched to manual focus and used focus peaking to get shots where the eye-fi wasn't working. But overall, it was really, really good. I would love for the system to somehow reach a point where Canon could, though, differentiate between an eye and an animal moving in a background and a twig in the foreground, because it just always picks up the twig. And I don't know how they do that, but I would love that to happen. I want to end this video kind of with, not a criticism, but maybe a deterring factor. And the thing that I think has been holding back a lot of people from buying this camera, and that's the low megapixel count. The megapixel count on the R6 is 20 megapixels. And that has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is you have a very small pixel density on the sensor, which means that things like dynamic range are better, ISO handling is better, just the picture quality in general is better. The downside, of course, is that you only have 20 megapixels to work with. And when you're doing photography, especially wildlife, you sometimes want to crop a little bit. And so if you crop in, you lose a lot of megapixels, and you can start to get to a really low megapixel count, which means that you can't print anymore. I don't think I cropped hardly at all, so I kept probably 20 to maybe 15 megapixels, which is definitely printable to the size I need. So for me, that's probably not an issue, but I have to be honest in saying that the megapixel count is something I think about when taking photos. When I'm taking a photo now, I'm thinking, am I going to need to crop this down? Am I going to lose a bunch of pixels? And at least it's in my head. So if you're thinking about buying the Canon R6, think about how big you might want to print things. These images in the background are A1, and to do a print that looks like this, you need about 12 megapixels minimum. If you're just using them on computer screens, it doesn't matter. I'm starting to lose my voice because I haven't talked this long in a really long time. So I'm going to end this video. That's it for the Canon R6. I'll talk to you later. Peace.